All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Before we get started, I want to say today's program, we'll be talking with historians John Guy and Julia Fox on authors of Hunting the Falcon, Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, and the Marriage That Shook Europe. The book is absolutely phenomenal. I'm very excited to listen to their presentation. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to please check out all of our upcoming programs at hudsonlibrary.org. And I had just mentioned on Wednesday, January 24th, we're going to be talking with historian Gareth Russell about his new book, The Palace from Tudors to the Windsors, 500 Years of British History at Hampton Court, which I think some of you who are here might be interested in that topic as well. You also can purchase copies of Hunting the Falcon from our local independent bookstore, The Learned Owl, and I'll include that link in the chat below. At any point during the event, feel free to ask questions and leave them in the Q&A section, and then at the end, we'll try to get to as many as possible. Now that that's out of the way, let me introduce our speakers today. John Guy is award-winning historian and fellow at Clare College, University of Cambridge, and is author of Mary, Queen of Scots, originally titled Queen of Scots, which was also later turned into 2018 film starring Saoirse Ronan and Margot Robbie. He has won multiple awards. He has contributed to numerous BBC programs and written for the Sunday Times, The Guardian, and the Daily Telegraph. Julia Fox has taught history in both state and private schools, specializing in the Tudors and 19th century. She is the author of Jane Boleyn, The True Story of the Infamous Lady of Rochford, which I now have to read after reading this book because I have so many questions. She also wrote Sister Queens, The Noble and Tragic Lives of Catherine of Aragon and Juana of Castile. Thank you so much, John and Julia, for joining us this afternoon.
It's a pleasure.
Absolute pleasure. When the French executioner sliced through Anne's neck, chilling, isn't it? Just after 9 o'clock in the morning on the 19th of May, it was a Friday, 1536, it marked the end of one of the most famous relationships in British history. That of Anne, you can see her on the right there, and Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII. Anne died in public. There were about 500 people who watched the French executioner do his work. But the relationship was also played out in public. In public in Henry's court, under the largely disapproving eyes of his courtiers, but also on the European stage. And here we have the three key European figures who figure in that story. On the left, a youngish Charles of Ghent, who becomes King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. He's also, by the way, Catherine of Aragon's nephew. So I think we've got a bit of a clue from the start as to which side on the Henry VIII versus Catherine of Aragon quarrel he's going to be. He's also, as you notice, Duke of Ghent. And that matters, Charles of Ghent, because Ghent, the Low Countries, in that is the city of Antwerp. And Antwerp is a key city for English trade. On the right, we have in the middle, so on, my right, we have Francis I of France, the great rival to Charles. The two are fairly evenly balanced, actually. If Henry joins one or t'other, it could make quite a difference. Certainly Henry's money could. And on the right, we've got Clement VII, the Pope, who had the power to dispense and to therefore annul the marriage of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. Now, whether he would or whether he wouldn't, we don't really know, because he wasn't entirely free to do as he wished. The popes then, unlike popes today, ruled about a third of Italy. And the trouble is that both Charles and Francis wanted great chunks of Italy. So the power struggle between those two affected the way in which the Pope could act. And what we found, and what is one of the key strands of our book, is that the relationship between Henry and Anne maps so beautifully onto English relations with Charles and with Francis. So that's a key theme. Another key theme of the book is that we both believe that your early life colours a lot of what happens to you later. And so we spent some time looking at the backstories for Henry and Anne. Henry, of course, a little bit more well known with regard to the backstory. Mollycoddled perhaps by his mother, adored his mother, hit badly by her death, and searched probably throughout his life, really, not for a mother substitute as such, but for somebody who would love him unconditionally as she did. And the father, Henry VII, remember that Henry is the spare, cruel word, but there you go, not the heir for some time. But when he becomes the heir on the death of Arthur, Henry VII basically envelops him. He is afraid that he could lose this son too. And so he is very much confined, very much constricted. But from that father, he also sees a little bit of how to rule. Henry VII largely rules through fear, I'm afraid, but it also showed the young Henry VIII that it is absolutely true, uneasy lies the head that bears the crown, because there were conspiracies all around. And Henry, throughout his life, feared rebellion and conspiracy. Anne.
So one of the most exciting parts of the book was actually to rediscover Anne's backstory in the years when she was in France. She was there for basically almost 7 years.
Yeah.
She is there from really the age of 13. And when that was 1514, and she was there until just before Christmas of 1521. And while she was there, she was on the screen here. We've got Louise of Savoy on the left, who's a great woman power broker at the French court, the mother of King Francis I. The very young Queen Claude, she's very much just a little bit older than Anne herself. A young woman, the daughter of Anne of Brittany, who had been the last wife of the previous French king. And Queen Claude, she's young, she is resilient. She was said to be a little bit sort of dumpy, really. I mean, she walked with a bit of a limp, but she was still a powerful woman in her own right. And on the right, of course, the quite amazing, almost like a proto-feminist, really, Marguerite of Angoulême, who's a distinguished writer as well as the king's sister, daughter of Louise of Savoy, and so the sister of King Francis I. A remarkable portrait there by Jean Clouet, which strangely ended up in of all places in Liverpool rather than in Paris. And of course, the great thing about these women were they were great power brokers at the French court. In the French court, of course, it was not possible because of the Salic law for a woman to succeed to the throne. But Francis I allowed these three women enormous power in France, and that was something that you just didn't get in England, where on the whole, queens exercised a certain role. I mean, sometimes there were powerful women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, of course, who was married to Henry II, but of course she was someone who ended up in revolt against her husband and broke with him, and that was the exception rather than the rule. Now, these three women, I think there are really three things that I'd like to say about them. They were in and out of each other's apartments, but also, of course, they were given great discretion in politics. Where Anne was, of course, with King Claude, she was a maid of honor to Claude. What that meant was where Claude was, Anne was with other women of approximately the same age. There were also more senior women of the in the Queen's service, but the maids of honor, they sat on cushions around the Queen, and they heard exactly what was happening in the Queen's secret apartments in the Privy Chamber. The thing about these three women is they're in and out of each other's apartments the whole time. It's like a sort of the court is very porous here. And the French court is not just based in Paris, it's trotting around the French countryside. A lot of time it spends in the Loire Valley, actually, where, of course, the famous chateaux still stand mostly today. So they're going around the country. Claude was also going into Normandy, into Brittany on summer visits, sometimes with Francis, almost always with these other two women. So Anne was watching these women at work. Now, I think there are three things that I would like to say to sort of show really the sort of experience that Anne had in France. The first thing is that particularly Louise of Savoy, and also to a considerable extent Marguerite of Angoulême, Francis allowed them great license, so that Louise of Savoy actually went off and negotiated treaties for the French crown on her own part from time to time. Anne's interviewed ambassadors, while Anne Boleyn's father, was briefly ambassador to France, particularly just before Anne came home, about the 18 months before Anne came home. He was able to visit Louise of Savoy. He was given special license to wander in and out of her apartments without making an appointment, which was a rare privilege. And Marguerite of Angoulême also was very much involved on the diplomatic scene, especially for about an 18-month period when King Francis had been captured by Charles V, the later incarnation of Charles of Ghent, after he became King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. There was a fight between Francis and Charles. Francis was captured in Italy after the Battle of Pavia, and Marguerite of Angoulême went to Madrid actually to try and get her brother out of jail. It didn't entirely work, but Francis was able to free himself shortly afterwards. So this is the experience that Anne sees. She sees these women negotiating independently with foreign ambassadors, taking an important role in politics. The second thing I want to say is that Anne was actually present when Marguerite of Angoulême at Argentan in 1517. Argentan is in Normandy, at the chateau there and in its park. She was made Duke of Berry in her own right by her brother Francis, which meant that she held an enormous estate, an enormous barony, an enormous income. It was made a special duchy. She was the Duke in her own right, as if she was a male. Her husband, she was married to a relative nonentity. He was expressly excluded in the deed of grant from either a share in any of the lands or in any of the money. So Anne saw a woman made a great peer, able to sit on the King's Council, on the Secret Council, as indeed Louise of Savoy did all the way through the reign. Now, the third thing I want to say is that Anne saw in France that the women's side, the Queen's side of the French court, operated on a very different model to the way that the English Queen's side of the court worked. The royal court had what we call two sides. There was the Queen's side, there was the King's side. They had their separate apartments and they had their own officers. The Queen's side was usually smaller than the King's. That's true in France as well as in England, but it's still a very substantial entity. Now, whereas in England, in Catherine of Aragon's court, in the Queen's court more generally, in England, it was a largely female space. Men did not go in unless they were actually relatives of the king or queen, or unless they were the officers of the queen, the essentially functionaries of the queen, and they were allowed to go in. But the queen's apartments were essentially a female space. That was not so in France, where men had relatively free access. Especially in the afternoons and in the evenings, they're able to go in and mingle with the women there. The private part was the Queen's bedchamber, her sleeping area. Sometimes, depending on the actual size of these rooms in the different palaces, that was defined slightly differently. And there was a very private area in the Queen's bedchamber where often, as the men quipped, the Queen held the court of the ladies with her maids of honor and her women, and they read and looked at fine manuscripts, and they talked women's talk and all of the things that they did on a more sort of intimate basis, made music, played games, all of those things. But that was very different. And of course, it was why quite often in France, periodically, there were talk of sex scandals where some of the maids or some of the women of the court got involved in illicit relationships with men. And in fact, Marguerite of Angoulême, in her writings, actually talked of this sort of thing and wrote in an astonishingly, if you like, 21st century or even Me Too, post-Me Too way about the predatory men and what they were up to. What they wanted was sex without strings, whether a woman was married or not. Men expected their wives or daughters to be chaste, but the men had very different ideas, and she was very aware of those sort of tensions. So those are the three things that I think Anne experienced on a more sort of political and social level. And then the next thing that she experienced, I've got on this slide here, was that the women of these women in the French court, they were all champions of the early French evangelical Reformation. That doesn't mean they supported Luther. The French had their own. Luther was too strong. He threatened a breach with the papacy, a breach with the doctrines, the central doctrines of the Catholic Church. But the French had their own early reformers, of which the most important was a man called Jacques Lefebvre d'Étaples. And he wrote a number of little books. The sort of things that he believed in was that religion should be simplified. It should be brought back to what the Gospels had originally asked for. It didn't need to be packed with miracle stories or pilgrimages or if you like, special events, the veneration of saints. What counted was simple faith in Christ. What counted was charity. The spirit of charity meant that when you did good works, you did it for the right reasons and not just to buy yourself a place in heaven because you happened to be rich. You actually believed that somehow you could find redemption through a simple faith in Christ, and through doing good works like charity, poor relief, welfare, and particularly education. And Queen Claude in particular believed that it was important to try and reform monasteries and nunneries to make them more, if you like, socially useful. But Lefebvre d'Étaples was somebody who also believed that putting simple faith into the hands of the ordinary people was best done now that printing had been invented through, if you like, pocket-size evangelical books, which were summaries of scripture or devotional texts. And Anne actually, when she got back to England, began collecting these books, and so did her brother George. And actually, you can see on the left-hand side, you can see how these are very simple little pocket books, but they were cheap. They were readily available. They were simple. Anybody who could read could cope with them, and collected them. And what's remarkable is that about 40 of those books collected either by Anne or her brother still survive and ended up, most of them, in the British Library. But they went actually after Anne's fall. They went into Henry's Royal Library. But when Anne rose up the system, when she became Marquis of Pembroke, when she became Queen, she had the taste. When Henry had said he wanted to marry her, she developed, when she had money, she also developed a taste for, if you like, the deluxe volumes that she had seen in France. Queen Claude, inherited from her mother Anne of Brittany, had an absolutely fabulous library of fine illuminated manuscripts. And the one in the middle, the book here in the middle, Anne's French Psalter, showing the Black Lion of Rochford, that was a family, that was the family title. Anne's father was ennobled. He was ennobled Viscount Rochford, and then later Earl of Wiltshire. Her brother became Viscount Rochford when the father was made Earl of Wiltshire. That's a French Psalter that she collected. It was actually in French. She acquired it. She got the French ambassador in London to get it for her. The one on the right is started out life as a simple little book printed by Dubois, like the one on the left, but her brother had it made in a specially illuminated manuscript. And you can actually see this is about the time that she was made Marquis of Pembroke and then became Queen. You can see in the initial letter T, you can see Anne's special badge, the white falcon, the silver falcon, the white falcon, wearing an imperial crown, the crown of England, holding a scepter. Standing on a root stock that was a royal symbol, if you like, a tree root, basically, with the roots going into the ground, and with Tudor roses, the red and white roses, sprouting out of the root stock. That was Anne's special symbol. But that started, although it's a very fancy manuscript, of course, it's another one by Lefebvre d'Etaples. This one's presented to her by George. It started out life as a simple book, and then Anne had this, as I say, this taste for these wonderful manuscripts.
Anne came back in about 1521, and what we could never really understand is why, because she does become, the love of Henry's life, why it is that this woman that he becomes so besotted with, he doesn't seem to notice for over 4 years, because it's certainly not until late 1525, beginning of 1526, that Henry suddenly notices her. Now, if you remember, we said that one of the key features of the book is the way in which the relationship of Henry and Anne maps onto European relations at the time. And originally, England was pro-Charles. But by the time you get to 1525-ish, that relationship has cooled and Henry is becoming pro-French. And suddenly, everything French is madly fashionable. And what is madly French and therefore madly fashionable? Anne. Straight back from the French court with French manners, French dress, the wonderful French hood that was her trademark, French chic, and Henry really does start to notice her. And we have left in the Vatican Library 17 love letters written by Henry to Anne. 9 are in French, 8 are in English. We don't sadly have any of Anne's to him, and none of them are dated. What is interesting, though, is that Henry actually wrote them in the first place. Henry hated writing. He actually said writing to me is tedious and painful. But nonetheless, he writes to her, and he writes to her almost bearing his soul. The letters are endearing, actually. They made me look at Henry in a different light. And sometimes, look right at the bottom of that love letter there. Can you see the heart? And inside, there's a little AB. He's like a little boy, a young boy writing something, to his sweetheart with a heart, her initials in it, almost carving it on a tree. It's really rather endearing, as I say. This one also is quite interesting because it's written in French in 1528, when Anne goes down with this terrible disease. It's sort of like COVID, but even worse, in that you could wake up in the morning and by the time you get to dinner, you're dead. It was that fast. She had the sickness. Henry didn't. He was one of the first people to practice social distancing and lockdowns. He kept away from sickness like mad. But in this letter, he actually says at one point that he would bear only half her sickness if it would help her. The letters are wonderful, but we can date a lot of them. They may not be dated in that, but we can date them according to what they actually refer to. But they do show that Henry is besotted with Anne. They don't show that he wants to marry her. At first he doesn't. I think he thought of her as another mistress. I mean, he'd had her sister before her. There's Anne. Yes, there's a bit of a vacancy in the mistress department. But of course, Anne is having none of it. And in the end, presses for marriage. And if you look at the next slide, you can see how they were even writing notes to each other in prayer books. And I think these are absolutely wonderful. You can see the writing along the bottom of each of them. There's Henry's love note in French. French, of course, was the language of courtly love, and a lot of the love letters are couched in the language of courtly love. You know, Henry is going to be her servant, that sort of thing. And look what he says. It's beneath the miniature of Christ as the man of sorrows, which is rather lovely. If you remember my love in your prayers as strongly as I adore you, I shall hardly be forgotten, for I am yours, Henry R., always. And then look at Anne's. First of all, look at the picture that she has chosen to write it underneath, the Annunciation, i.e., when the angel tells Mary that she is going to bear the Christ child, a son, a child. And of course, what does Henry want most of all? A son. And look at her response, though. By daily proof you shall me find to be to you both loving and kind. One of the things we're often asked is, do these two really love each other? Well, I think if you look at those two messages, you've got a pretty big clue. Look at Henry's and then look at Anne's. Henry's is full of passion. Anne's is almost of the sort that you might have in a marriage ceremony, the sort of thing that a wife promises her husband. It's not really filled with passion.
Well, of course, as soon as Henry saw that in order to get Anne, he would have to marry her because she made that absolutely plain, then, of course, they have to work for Henry to get a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. And what is quite striking, and when we were on this section of the book, we set out, of course, we were determined not to get bogged down in the whole complicated business of Henry VIII's divorce. And then, as in a way, I suppose, for a while we did get a bit bogged down, but then, of course, we suddenly realized what was going on, that this is a period, and it took a while. I mean, the divorce campaign really begins in the spring of 1527, and it's not really resolved really until really 1533. And so you're in a period of almost 6 years of, as it seemed to be, limbo. But the thing is that, of course, what we discovered was that this was the great period when Anne and Henry were working together for the same thing on what we now call the joint enterprise. This is a joint enterprise. They're doing it together. It isn't Henry who's doing it with Anne just chipping in occasionally. Anne is actually sending her own diplomats to Europe and to Rome. They're writing back to her. Sometimes Henry's diplomats are told to go and report to Anne first before they actually see Henry. Anne is at least 50% and some of the time 60 or 70% devising the strategy. It's her people who find the eventual solution, which would be to have a divorce granted in England and just cut the Pope out of the whole story, which of course does involve breaking with Rome, which is a very radical step for a Catholic who has so far been as conservative and pro-papal as Henry. But Anne is driving things here, but in particular, she is driving things forward in France to get the French to help her. And it's often said, I mean, Julie has already mentioned that that Henry first notices Anne when, of course, his own diplomacy switches away from Charles V and Spain towards Francis because of the balance of power in Italy. He notices Anne, and then Anne uses all of the resources that she can muster, all the contacts that she has in France, that she has at her disposal, and gets Francis I to lobby at Rome for her and Henry, which the French king does, and in the end they contrive to get a special legate sent from Rome, Cardinal Campeggio, who's to come and join Henry's then chief minister, Cardinal Wolsey, to sit jointly to hear the case for Henry's divorce. And what we've got here is a letter. The letter on the left is in Anne's own handwriting. That's not doctored. It's not a copy. It's been damaged in a fire. Many of the crucial documents in this story were kept originally in a place called Ashburnham House, which was just near to what's now Westminster Abbey, and they were stored there. And in 1731, there was a terrible fire, and many of them were burnt, all singed, and these are burnt at the edges. That's a very sort of typical look for manuscripts that were in that particular part of Ashburnham House, but we still have them, fortunately, and even more fortunately, some of the crucial ones had been transcribed by scholars working largely on the Reformation rather than Henry's story, but they had transcribed these documents, and we can still see their transcripts and compare them with what's left of the manuscripts, so we can be fairly sure which transcriptions are accurate and which are not. Well, the letter on the left is to Wolsey urging him to expedite Henry's divorce, but the one on the right, which is the sensational piece, is a joint letter of Henry and Anne to Wolsey. The writer of this letter, Henry, writes at the bottom in his own inimitable hand. You can just see at the bottom the H for H and the beginning of a Henry, and then there'll be an R after that, which is cut out, burnt off. But this joint letter of Henry, just before the arrival of the legate Lorenzo Campeggi, the writer of this letter would not cease, this is to Wolsey, till she had caused me likewise to set my hand, Henry R. And Anne's diplomacy had a remarkable effect. She was particularly marked out and disliked, I think, by most English courtiers for the fact that, well, of course, most English courtiers at the time were still in favor, were still Catherine's supporters, but she was particularly disliked because she would greet French ambassadors. She would come down into the court, into the riverside to help to escort them off their barge. She would give them a kiss on the cheeks in the French manner, and then take them up to her apartments. She had dinners for the French ambassadors. She feted them. She courted them, and of course, what this ended up with was two big events which culminate in 1532, in which on the very same day, Sunday the 1st of September 1532, first of all, Anne is made Marquis of Pembroke in her own right, with the French ambassador as the guest of honor. And Anne's grant as Marquis of Pembroke means that she is created as if she were a male, the Marquis of Pembroke in her own right, not the Marchioness. She's the Marquis of Pembroke in her own right. She's given vast estates. She's entitled to sit in the House of Lords on her own account with all the men. There's no evidence that she ever exercised that right, but she was entitled to do that. The marquisate would descend to her offspring, and the grant is exactly modelled on the grant that Francis I gave to Marguerite of Angoulême in 1517 when he made her Duke of Berry. And that has to be significant. And then immediately after this ceremony, a treaty which Anne has largely been responsible for getting into motion. It's taken her 2-3 years to do that, but she's got a treaty called the Treaty of Mutual Aid between France and England. And this is the first and most important treaty ever between France and England, because it is a joint treaty of offensive and defensive alliance. That is, not just will Francis simply help to defend Henry if he gets into trouble, say with Charles V, but he will actually send ships, soldiers, and men to wherever to help Henry, and Henry will do the same for Francis. So that's a very big deal. And of course, Anne's plan was that this would be the prelude to a special summit between Henry and Francis in Calais and Boulogne, in which she would go as de facto queen, as effectively queen, and her plan was that she would actually be married to Henry at Calais in the presence of the French nobles, with Francis as the guest, King Francis as the guest of honor. But there just wasn't time to arrange it. It was just, by the time we'd got to the beginning of September 1532, the summit was set for October, and the idea that the idea that somehow she would marry Henry without getting properly divorced, with Henry not getting properly divorced from Catherine. He would have had to have been married bigamously for a while. This was just too much for the English nobility at this time. So they had the summit, but they didn't actually have the wedding there. But at the summit, not only did Francis recognize Anne, dance with her after a special banquet, and talk privately with her. He also gave her very expensive luxury gifts, and he presented Henry and Anne jointly with gifts, and one of those was an absolutely spectacular bed, which clearly a future marital bed, which he'd purchased from, from actually Audinet Turquet, who was a luxury goods dealer in Paris, the sort of Louis Vuitton or whatever of the day. Fabulously expensive. So the Treaty of Mutual Aid is a very big deal, and the summit at Calais and Boulogne is a very big deal. And it's immediately after that that recognition. As soon as they get back to Dover, Henry and get back to Dover after that summit, they secretly marry, and then they marry still secretly, but probably more legally, because the first time it doesn't seem that they had a proper priest. But in January 1533, they do secretly marry with a priest, and that paves the way for Henry then to push for Anne's coronation.
And here we have some wonderful examples of Anne's coronation, which was stupendous. Lasted 5 days, began with a river procession from the Tower. There were about 320 little boats taking part in that. Then there was a procession through the streets of London, through, well, I wouldn't say cheering crowds, interested and curious crowds, certainly. And there were, along the way, there were various pageants put on for her delectation. The one on the left is absolutely wonderful. It was Holbein's design for a pageant for the Hanseatic merchants. And you can see Apollo is seated on a throne, and the throne was a sort of marble fountain from which free wine gushed. But the interesting thing, of course, is look at the top of that little arch immediately above Apollo in the middle there, and you've got Anne's Falcon badge, and it's a crowned falcon again. On the right, we have the banquet that followed her coronation, Anne sitting in splendid isolation. This is the seating plan, as you can see, for the banquet. She's in splendid isolation at the top table with Archbishop Cranmer sitting a little way away from her, and everybody else on various rows. But the best bit, I'm afraid, is the bit in the middle, which we haven't got a picture of. I'm so sorry, but there isn't one. But that is the coronation itself. And what is amazing about this coronation is that Anne was crowned as though she was a reigning monarch, as though she was a queen regnant. She sat on St. Edward's chair, the self-same chair that our late queen was crowned on, that our current king was crowned on, and it is only 4 monarchs. And she was crowned with St. Edward's crown, not the consort's crown, the crown reserved for the king. So she was crowned as though she was a joint sovereign with her husband. At one time, he had wondered about joint sovereignty. I doubt it would have actually happened. He may have given her various responsibilities, but sharing power perhaps was not something that Henry would have done. But to be crowned as a queen regnant, boy, is that something.
But I think there's no other king. There's no other king who has crowned his wife.
No.
As a reigning monarch in the whole of British history, and no queen has ever been crowned sitting on St. Edward's chair other than Anne Boleyn. So this is quite remarkable. We should say, of course, that just by Cranmer here is on that top table, and of course it's because he'd just been made Archbishop of Canterbury. Fortunately, the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, who opposed Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, had died, and because of the French influence at Rome, and very few British historians have ever discovered this, it was because of the French influence at Rome. It was Francis who got Pope Clement VII to get Francis who got Pope Clement VII to issue the bulls, the approval for Cranmer to be made Archbishop of Canterbury. And the minute Cranmer becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, just a few days before this coronation, actually, he pronounces a divorce between Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII in England. So they just nipped in before the coronation. But of course, Henry had been, strictly speaking, bigamously married between the secret marriage of January 1533 and the coronation, which was on the 1st of June. And the other thing to say about the coronation is the reason it had to be speeded up, and there wasn't time really to sort of basically iron out all the wrinkles of this possible coronation ceremony, because Anne was heavily pregnant. By then she was 7 months pregnant. So now, of course, Anne is queen. And one of the things that we did in this book, I think probably the two most original things we did in this book was to rediscover Anne's experiences in France in that earlier period, in that backstory, because until we set to work, nobody knew anything really at all about what she'd done other than she'd been there. But another thing that we set out to do, which I think we were able to do really reasonably successfully, was actually to unpick who were the women, not just the men, who were the women on Anne's side of the court, not just the men on Henry's side of the court. Who exactly was it who surrounded Anne on her side of the court? And the remarkable thing is that we were actually able to find out who they were. And it's a list of about 20 people, but it basically comprises 4 groups. One are Anne's own relatives, like her sister Mary Boleyn. That is until Mary goes off and makes very much the wrong sort of marriage as far as Anne and Henry were concerned. Certainly Anne concerned. She married down rather than married up. And then there was a bit of a family falling out about that. But to begin with, Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister, and then Jane Parker, who had married Anne's brother George. Jane Parker, perhaps better known as Lady Rochford. Lady Anne Shelton, who was Anne's aunt, Anne's favourite aunt, and Mary Howard, who you can see on the left here, who was drawn by Holbein in readiness for a portrait that doesn't actually now survive, but the drawing still survives. Lady Mary Howard, who is Anne's cousin and lady in waiting. And we know that, by the way, Holbein did that drawing while Anne was queen, because that one has an inscription on the back which enables us to date it. So the first group are Anne's relatives, and they were Anne's supporters. There were also Anne's friends. She had a number of personal friends. One is Bridget Wilshire, who was also who married Sir Richard Wingfield as her first husband and is best known to history as Lady Wingfield. She was very close to Anne. We don't have an image of her because she actually died before Holbein started drawing Anne's gentlewomen. And another friend is Elizabeth Brown, who had actually officiated as a lady in attendance on Anne at the coronation, and had basically who'd held the napkin to her so that Anne could wipe her cheeks and fingers whenever she wanted to with a napkin. Elizabeth Brown was a particular friend, and of course Anne actually we discovered that Anne lent her money. Elizabeth Brown went on to marry the Earl of Worcester and became the Countess of Worcester. But it was a thing between Anne and Elizabeth Brown that on no account should Anne or ever let it to be known to Elizabeth Brown's husband that she was in debt to Anne. So there were relations and friends. There were also gentlewomen, most of whom had been around perhaps before and perhaps served Catherine of Aragon, but who became loyal to and particular friends of Anne. And one was Mary Shelton, who's also Anne's cousin and a gentlewoman. That's a beautiful drawing by Holbein. That's number 2 from in the left, to the right of Mary Howard. She later married
Anthony Hill.
Anthony Heavingham. That's why it's called the Lady Heavingham at the top. But that is undoubtedly Mary Shelton. Another one is very possibly this Mistress Zouche, Anne Gainsford, who was there early on with Anne, one of her earliest gentlewomen, who married George Zouche. It's almost certainly her. It's just a possibility. It could be the daughter of Lord Zouche. Personally, we don't think it is, but we have to allow that there are two possibilities
And she was
there.
also wearing the wonderful French
And she's
hood.
wearing the archetypal French hood, exactly so, different to the gable headdress that some of the others are wearing. And then, of course, there are career courtiers, and these are the ones that tended to get overlooked. Mary Kingston, we don't have an image of her, but she was hugely loyal to Catherine of Aragon all the way through, married to the Constable of the Tower, the man who eventually led Anne to her execution on her execution day. There was the aunt who didn't get on with Anne, who we never quite found out why they hated each other so much, but Lady Elizabeth Boleyn, who was married to Anne's uncle, Sir James Boleyn. And there was a woman called Marjorie Horseman, who was one of Anne's gentlewomen, but had been a career courtier under Catherine of Aragon. And she started out relatively favorably to Anne and was actually quite supportive of Anne. But then, very interestingly, 6 months, 8 months before Anne's fall, she is suborned by the rising star, the man who helped Henry get the divorce through Parliament, Thomas Cromwell, the man who was a former servant of the First Minister, Cardinal Wolsey, a man of oceanic ambitions who's hoping to rise to power. And Marjorie Horseman starts sending him information, among others. Now, I think the point that we want to make about this is that there are these different groups of women, and some are pro-Anne and some are not pro-Anne, because in fact they were all along Catherine of Aragon's people, and they bitterly resent the fact that Catherine was shoved out and Anne was brought in. But these women, all of them, they see everything. They see the best of Anne, they see the worst of Anne, and Anne did have a bit of a temper. She had a wonderful fast repartee, but she also had a sharp tongue. She could be quite cutting sometimes, and she made enemies, and of course people were determined to be her enemy anyway because they were Catherine of Aragon's supporters. So it's a mixed bunch, but they see everything. There is no privacy in royal courts. So, when Anne thinks she's pregnant, they all know. When she doesn't have a period, they all know. If she does have a period, they all know. And one can see, and also they all have, or nearly all have, brothers, or in some cases husbands on the king's side of the court to whom they pass information. So this is not, I think it's a common assumption that when you become queen, you pick your own people. But that is not actually so. The king supervised who was put on the queen's side of the court, and sort of vets who's there. And as I say, it's not just relatives and friends, it's also these career courtiers who are particularly dangerous because they're looking after themselves as well as looking after the queen.
Anne acted as queen in all sorts of different ways. She really did, having built on what happened to her in France, become involved with poor relief, with education. She wanted the new ideas of the evangelicals to spread. She doesn't actually want to destroy the Catholic Church. She's, as we said, no Lutheran, but she's interested in monastic reform, the reform of nunneries, social relief, poor relief. But in her chamber, she did, again, it's the link with France, she allowed the mixing of the sexes. And you can see from this wonderful, wonderful piece that we've got up here, just what this could lead to. There's a manuscript known as the Devonshire manuscript. It starts off as being owned by Mary Howard. It ends up being owned by Henry's niece, Margaret Douglas, the daughter of his sister Margaret. And in this, it's a sort of book really that's passed between a group of friends at the court, and they write to each other. Sometimes they copy poems into it. There are several by Thomas Wyatt, although he didn't actually write in it himself. There may or may not be some by George, maybe, but probably not. And sometimes some of the young swains of the court wrote poems to the ladies themselves. And you've got a wonderful one here. This is an acrostic, actually. If you look at the initial letter of each stanza, it spells out the word Shelton. In other words, it's for Mary Shelton, who was quite a goer, actually, Mary Shelton. Be wonderful on a sort of girls' night out, I think. She was quite amazing. And you can see that this poem is written there. And Margaret Douglas probably says, you know, this isn't much good. Forget this, Margaret Douglas. But Mary Shelton immediately comes back and says, no, it is worthy, Mary Shelton. And by the end of it, you can see there, I don't know if you can see John's finger pointing it out, even though it might be worthy, she's not going to accept it. She says undeserved, you can see the sort of original there, but it becomes undesired service requires no hire. Well, this sort of thing was going forward between the ladies, between the gentlemen, which is seemingly harmless. But Margaret Douglas, who's in this book and who ends up holding this book at the end, and is in Anne's chamber, actually meets up with one of the Howards, Lord Thomas Howard, and the two of them have a rip-roaring affair. They apparently sneak into Lady Elizabeth Boleyn. She was a bit of a policewoman of the chamber there. They sneak into her chamber when she's not there and basically have sex. They have a secret marriage, and the whole thing is a dreadful scandal. Now, we know it doesn't break, the scandal doesn't break while Anne is alive. It breaks a few weeks after her death, and Thomas Howard is sent to the Tower, where he dies of disease, actually. And Margaret Douglas is eventually sort of forgiven under house arrest for a while, and goes on, in fact, to marry elsewhere. And she is the mother, of course, of Lord Darnley, who marries Mary, Queen of Scots. But the point is that in the various investigations, Thomas Howard admits that the affair was going on for a year. So in other words, it was going on whilst Anne was queen. If she didn't know about it, she should have done, and she should have stopped it. If she did know about it, and I don't suppose for one moment she did, she was condoning basically immorality. So it is showing what could be twisted, because this is an example of some of the repartee, if you like, as it starts, getting out of hand. And that was the problem in Anne's chamber. She herself could be over familiar with some of the gentlemen of the court. And if you are determined to see the worst of her, well, then once some of this comes to light, and Henry is perhaps having other thoughts, etc., about her, and of course she hasn't had the son, then all of this can get very, very dramatically, and for Anne, tragically twisted.
Well, after some 3 years, it's clear that Anne has had a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth, but she has not had a son. She's had 2 miscarriages. One was probably a stillbirth because it was in the 3rd trimester. That was in 1534. But I think the most important thing is that by 1536, the politics of Europe are changing, and suddenly Henry's wondering whether or not he might make a rapprochement with Charles.
Yeah.
Francis I isn't helping him at Rome in the way that he'd hoped. Henry really, in his heart, always hoped that even though he'd married Anne Boleyn with a divorce granted in England, but not properly by the Catholic Church, the Pope would eventually come round and grant it anyway. so that he get a retrospective divorce, but he's not getting that, and he thinks Francis isn't helping him enough. He then, during the summer progress into, they go on a tour in the summer of 1535, an extended tour down towards Bristol and Gloucestershire, and then they come back along what's effectively the M4 now, along that sort of route, and then they go into Hampshire before going back into into London. Casts his eye at one of the visits at the Seymour house on Jane Seymour, who's one of Catherine's maids. And he's one of Anne's maids, yes. Well, he'd been one of Catherine's maids, and also she's later Anne's gentlewoman. And he sizes her up and just sort of thinks about it. Meanwhile, Cromwell is lobbying Henry to switch sides, to switch from a French alliance to the imperial one with Charles V. And he's got a reason for supporting the imperial side, the Charles V side, because you remember Julia said at the beginning that the old Burgundian territories, what's now effectively Belgium, Antwerp, that sort of area, was very, very important for English trade. That's where the bulk of English trade and the bulk of English supplies came from. The center of European gravity and of economic gravity in Northern Europe was not yet London in Henry VIII's reign. It was actually in Antwerp. And so if Charles V closed down trade, there was the English economy basically came to a stop. So he had his reasons for doing that. He also doesn't get on with Anne. You know, he's very happy to think that a day might come when Henry is actually married to a different sort of wife. And then Henry hears from his ambassador to Charles in a dispatch sent in 1515, just before Easter in 1536. A lot of it, the news is quite old actually. At the time, Charles V is marching up from the south of Italy towards Rome. He's going to go actually meet the Pope in Rome, and Pate is with Charles, and he discovers just before they arrive in Rome, he discovers that Charles is actually thinking of enforcing a decree which the Pope by this time has become, far from coming round to Henry's point of view, has become absolutely fed up with Henry and is scandalized by the fact that Henry married Anne Boleyn without a proper Catholic divorce. He's decided to excommunicate Henry and declare him a heretic, and to declare him deprived of his kingdom, which Henry wouldn't worry about if it could be enforced. But of course, he's now talking about the possibility of enforcing it. And in this ciphered dispatch, fortunately, we didn't have to decipher it. It's ciphered on the left-hand side, but when it arrived in London, it was deciphered. And although it's quite heavily burnt at the charred at the edges, we were able to read most of it. Charles has decided that he will support the excommunication and the enforcement of the decree of deposition against Henry. And what's more, Pate has discovered that the French diplomats in Rome have raised no objection, and Henry by that is quite seriously frightened. So he's thinking that actually he might switch sides. Since the beginning of the year, he's been actually he's got fed up with Francis because they won't help him enough. If the French won't help him enough, he has been conducting, if you like, as an auction as to who will give him the most in return for his support, particularly, and his money, particularly for use in Italy. He's a little bit undecided. Of course, it's possible that he could make a rapprochement with France because, very conveniently for him, Catherine of Aragon died in January of 1536, and once she's dead, of course, it's much less important to Charles to block a possible rapprochement with Henry, because his aunt Catherine is not standing in the way. So you know, things are poised on a knife edge, and then Cromwell puts the boot in.
Yes, he does.
Cromwell puts the boot in. He puts the boot in here because what he does is he uses the information that he's gained from his spies on Anne's side of the court, and basically intelligence which effectively he's just made up. to accuse Anne of multiple adultery, not just of enforcing a lax discipline on her side of the court, but accusing Anne of adultery with four gentlemen, with four gentlemen, but also of incest with her brother. So she's basically had sex with five men illicitly, four of whom are gentlemen who've been wandering in and out of the Queen's side of the court from Henry's side because of this mingling of the sexes, and also George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. There's absolutely no evidence for the fact that this ever happened. In fact, when you compare the indictment of Anne and all the dates and allegations and look them all up, you see that they couldn't possibly have happened on those particular dates or in those places. So a lot of this is made up, but the crucial thing is that Henry believes it. Henry believes it because he believes that Anne has now become a liability, largely because of her very close relationship with France, and also by the fact that she won't give up her reformed interests, and she won't give up. The big obstacle to a rapprochement with Charles is that Charles wants Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, Mary, to succeed should Henry die without a male heir, whereas Anne won't give up. In the end, it does become dynastic. Yes. She won't give up if she won't give up Elizabeth's claim to be the successor if Henry dies without a son. And so Henry basically makes the decision, and Anne has to go, and that is the tragic end to the story.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. We had so many people write in to say that they loved the presentation and just how cohesive and rich the details were. They loved it. We have some questions here, if you're okay with me asking a few.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So we have one from Reggie. He wrote, do you think Anne and Henry's relationship had an influence on the artistic or literary cultures of Tudor England? Sonnets, for example, seem to be introduced in England around this time, despite their much earlier origin. And does their introduction have something to do with Henry and Anne's relationship?
Introduction of what was that? I'm sorry.
Well, I think Holbein is the key here.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that had always been questioned was whether Holbein was working for Anne Boleyn, and actually we investigated this in quite a lot of depth, and we decided that he did. That Anne was actually using Holbein. I mean, other people had used Holbein, of course, before. Thomas More had first introduced Holbein into the, if you like, the English courtly circle, but he hadn't really caught on, particularly with the royal family. But I think there's absolutely no doubt that he was working. He did design jewelry for Anne. And Anne commissioned a standing cup for Henry as a New Year's gift from Holbein, and the design still exists, and there's an illustration of it in our book. And of course, the other thing, of course, is that she commissioned a remarkable, very small, what was called a tablet miniature. It's a very small coloured drawing of Henry as supreme head of the church. It shows the biblical scene of King Solomon receiving the homage of the Queen of Sheba, which of course it was an analogue for Henry receiving the homage of the Church of England, because Sheba was often an analogue for the church. And you can see the king sitting on his throne there is a dead ringer for Henry. So I mean, it's absolutely true that if Holbein painted Anne himself, that portrait was destroyed, but then Henry managed to destroy just about everything that related to Anne after her death. The only thing that escaped the cull, apart from one or two books that Anne had given away before she was executed, the only things that really survived were those very cheap print books which Anne and George had owned, which do now end up, which went into the Royal Library, and we can trace them being catalogued in the list of the Royal Library, and then largely ended up in the British Library. But I mean, yes, I mean, and also of course George Boleyn was using the Horenbouts, who were existing miniaturists, at the Tudor court. But George used the Hornbouts. We were able to show that the manuscript that I showed you of the Ecclesiaste by Jacques Lefebvre d'Étaples, that he had done up in a luxury version, which showed Anne's falcon badge of the crowned falcon with the scepter, and standing on the rootstock. That illustration was actually done by Hornbout. So yeah, I mean, Anne played an important part. So, however, did Thomas Cromwell, who also became a patron of Holbein. And then, of course, after Anne's death, Henry discovered Holbein himself to do the grand privy chamber wall fresco, showing himself as an imperial king in that great posture, in the dynastic portrait with his father and his mother, and with of course Jane Seymour, who became his ideal wife because she basically married him, had the son that he wanted, and then died
before he got too
so
tired.
she was in a way the perfect queen, because she had the son, and then died before he could
Absolutely.
she could disappoint him.
Well, thank you. We had I should have asked this one first. Someone wanted to know, Donna wanted to know just how you pronounce Anne's last name.
Well, we always say Boleyn. It has been said that sometimes it's Boleyn, but
it could have well been Boleyn.
Could be either.
And the family badge, the early family badge was a bull.
It was.
And there are some scholars who insist on calling her Anne Boleyn.
That's right.
And including British scholars.
Yes.
We've just gone with the flow in century and called it Boleyn.
Exactly.
But I mean, they wrote their name Boleyn.
Yeah.
Boleyn.
Yeah.
Bullen.
Yeah.
B-U-L-L-E-Y-N.
No standardization, I'm afraid.
They wrote the name B-O-L-E-Y-N. There's no standardization. Anne also often wrote it B-O-L-E-N, Boleyn.
Yeah.
So there's no standardization there. So
here's your money and you take your choice, I think.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We have Heather would like to know, during the research, did you find it difficult to get access to the originals, or did you need to get translators, or did you have others help with your research?
We had nobody to help with our research, no. We do it ourselves. We didn't need translators or transcribers. What we did find was that when we first started this, we had thought we would have to spend some time in Paris looking at the French archives, but it all coincided with the advent of the pandemic. So of course we couldn't, because, lockdown, etc. But the French locked down that little bit earlier, that little bit later than we did. And so we were able to get transcripts of most of the French documents through the digital ones, through the Bibliothèque Nationale, etc. And some of the other things that we have used, we had already obtained for ourselves here from the National Archives and from the British Library. So no, we do it all ourselves. It's all, it's an in-house job, this.
No, I mean, we've never used research assistants ever.
Never.
It was the trouble is that if you use research assistants, your research is only as good as your research assistant.
Yeah, and you're going to have to check
and you're going to have to double check everything, and it's just essentially
not worth
it's better to do it yourself. I think. Do I have a bit of advice though for anybody who's in this webinar? If you're going to sign up for a major book that involves 6 months work in a foreign archive, in our case in Paris, don't do it.
Don't do it
at the beginning of the pandemic. But as Julia said, the French were absolutely marvelous. I mean, the many of the English documents are not unknown. I think if you get the original document rather than just reading other people's transcripts, you actually get much more out of them.
You do.
And usually, even the printed versions, even the so-called standard version of the love letters of Henry, and the letters of Anne are actually full of mistranscriptions.
Yes.
When you get the original, when you get to see the original manuscripts in the Vatican or in Paris or in London or wherever they may be, you actually find that usually the printed versions have mistakes, some of them quite serious.
Mm.
So we have gone back to first principles for absolutely everything. But I think it's fair to say, well, of course, as Julia says, fortunately, I'd gone off to the National Archives and elsewhere with a digital camera in the summer of 2019. And most of the British stuff, almost all the British stuff, I had photographed before the pandemic.
So we actually had it at our fingertips anyway.
But the French material, we were able to get digitized versions of entire manuscripts from the Bibliothèque Nationale and also from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which, believe it or not, still holds large quantities of the more important diplomatic documents and copies of treaties. The Treaty of Mutual Aid, of which Henry's copy is lost, we found in Paris. And that's in the Archives Nationales also in Paris. We are able to get hold of that way. I think it's fair to say that, I mean, we're also quite lucky for us is that, I mean, we're pretty good in both French and English manuscripts. The most important manuscripts for the European scene are all in French, because even though Charles V became King of Spain, because he was originally Burgundian and brought up in the Low Countries near Brussels, he spoke French, and his preferred language was French.
Yeah.
And
Not even sure he
the Spanish ambassador, with whom Cromwell, of course, became terribly friendly, wasn't in fact Spanish. He was Savoyard. He was an imperial ambassador rather than a Spanish ambassador, and because he was of Savoy, he also spoke French.
Came from Lake Annecy.
So he came from Annecy in France. So Charles and Chapuis corresponded in French, and the regent and the regent of, in the later years, the years of Anne's fall, the regent of the Netherlands, of the Burgundian Netherlands in Brussels, Marie of Hungary, she also spoke French and wrote in French. So that was a big help to us. So we became dab hands also at dealing with the French as well as the English documents. And of course, I'd had a good experience of the French documents through working on Mary Queen of Scots, 20 years ago. So it was a sort of revisit.
I was going to say the level of research that went into this book is amazing, and the level of details you both went into is just absolutely fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed it. We have time. We'll do, we had a lot of people saying that they're looking forward to doing some deeper digging into after reading your book.
Wonderful.
We have one final question we're going to end with, and just what inspired you to write the story from this, we'll take a look at the story that was so well known from this new angle, or like bring new light to it.
I think we were very interested in the Boleyns anyway. I'd written on them for Jane Rochford, and that sort of started my interest in them as a family. John had, of course, written a great deal on the Tudor period anyway, and it was a sort of marrying of ideas, really. But it was once we started to delve in that we realized that, yeah, you're not going to change the story as such, in that you're not going to suddenly say, guess what, there was a last minute reprieve for Anne and she rode off into the sunset. Of course you're not. But you might be able to put things together. You might be able to rearrange things to allow you to look beneath what has always been sort of the established pattern, really. What would you say, John?
Well, I think we just knew, at least, I mean, I knew more probably about Henry and the court before. I knew about Jane Boleyn, of course, from Julia's book, and I knew that Julia knew an enormous amount about the Boleyns, much of which she actually hadn't used, and which includes a lot of the backstory of particularly of Thomas Boleyn and George Boleyn. And I was just intrigued to find out what had happened in France with Anne. And of course, then I stumbled into the fact that, she had this these very sort of deep contacts in France built up in that 7-year period. And then, of course, I knew that there were a lot of French documents to do with the story that had never really been properly used. At least not, they'd been used a little bit by a scholar called Friedman, who was writing in the 1880s. And he was actually a German historian, but he used the French archives, and he more than scratched the surface at the potential. And then, of course, it became possible especially in the end, because we got digitized copies of whole manuscripts, so that we were just looking at the manuscript. It was better than being in the Bibliothèque Nationale, actually, because taking notes, as I'd had to do for Mary Queen of Scots, because you take a note and then you come out of the reading room, and then you come back to the to the UK, and then you realize that actually you didn't note the bit that you really now needed.
No, because it was on the next page, and
you stop there, and actually you could just go back to the manuscript because you had a digitized version.
Yeah.
But I realized we had all this stuff, and I knew that of what had been printed, the English stuff had been used extensively, but not completely, because no one used the financial accounts properly to work out exactly what Anne was getting and what the Boleyns were getting from the manuscripts, only from printed, from abstracts. But I realized that the Spanish, that rather the imperial side of it, had been quite well catalogued, and that was sort of well known. But of course, the French side had been largely ignored, and there were all these French documents that just needed to be integrated into the story. And that's when we realized, of course, that the whole story pivots on this relationship with France and the role that Anne played, first as an active agent in this joint enterprise with Henry to get the divorce. I mean, and sending people all around Europe, and that's extraordinary, and collecting these books. And then, of course, we were able to. There's a Canadian scholar called James Carley who'd worked extensively on Henry's library and the royal books, and we realized that we could key up these books by Simon de Beauvoir with Henry's library, and we realized, of course, that they was only the Boleyns who were collecting these books. Nobody else wanted them, and certainly not Henry. And so that became very, very significant. And of course, it was because of that we could unpick quite a lot of really the true basis of Anne's religious faith. Not that she was a Lutheran, but she was a reformer in this French mode. So everything started to fit into place. And then, of course, in the 1536, for the fall, the great argument was whether or not it was simply a plot by Cromwell to destroy Anne because he didn't like her and wanted to have this rapprochement with Charles, or whether or not it was Henry that decided to divest himself of her. And so then we did what effectively became a sort of countdown to disaster on a daily basis, and discovering that it was fluid absolutely right till the end. Until basically,
it was the night before.
Until basically, it was the night before the arrest. The night before, when Cromwell came in with these new allegations based on a so-called confession from Mark Smeaton and other things that he'd got from his spies on Anne's side of the court, of whom I think Marjorie Horseman has to bear a leading
no proof.
And then they started. Well, there is some proof actually.
Well,
a little bit of proof.
There's that one major
and then he started in the interrogations, and then of course we were able to. I had discovered something completely unknown. Because the great argument had always been whether or not the archive had been doctored by Cromwell afterwards to cover up his tracks, or doctored in Elizabeth's reign by Elizabeth to protect her mother's reputation. And I was able to use an inventory of the state papers, which had been compiled in 1544, long after Cromwell, 4 years after Cromwell's execution. And after the whole sort of Anne Boleyn thing had died down, to prove that some documents had still survived, but of course they're just lost to us, probably because of disasters in the history of the state papers. Fire, there was a big fire in 1619. A lot of damage was done by rats and vermin, and things just didn't survive. There was no proof that anything had ever been constructively destroyed, or that anything is missing from the evidence of the trials themselves are on parchment, and those are absolutely complete. Which I did do, before it was before 2019 actually, I compared the evidence from the so-called controlment role, the crucial role for Anne and George and the gentlemen's the four gentlemen plus George, the trials and Anne's trial, to see if anything was actually missing that was on the rolls for other state trials, and there was nothing missing, so that it's clear that there was no sort of plot here. And we were dealing with things pretty much as they came up, but with absences due to the passing of time and just the usual sorts of damage that you get: fire, rats, vermin.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for your time. This has been absolutely fascinating. Again, this is the history of their marriage and everything is a story I thought I was well aware of, especially through my own background. But I was uncovering stuff and being able to frame and put so much emphasis on her time in France was just, to me, was fantastic. I encourage everyone, I put the link again in the chat if you'd like to purchase a copy of Hunting the Falcon through our local independent bookstore, that is there. And I just want to thank you both so much. This has been just an absolute delight.
It was a pleasure for us too,
It's been a
honestly.
pleasure. Yes,
Absolute
absolutely. It's a
pleasure.
pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.